People like to say that hard work always gets noticed. I used to believe that. For nearly 6 years, I worked as a logistics coordinator for one of the largest distribution companies in the Midwest. It wasn't a glamorous job. I wasn't closing million-dollar deals or giving presentations in glass conference rooms. My world was shipping schedules, inventory reports, vendor calls, damaged freight claims, and solving problems before anyone else even realized they existed. I actually liked it. Every morning I arrived before 7. I'd make coffee, check overnight deliveries, answer emails from suppliers in different time zones, and prepare reports before the warehouse managers walked in. By 8:30, I usually already knew which trucks would be delayed, which customer orders needed adjustments, and where problems were likely to happen. It wasn't exciting work, but I was good at it. My manager Brian used to tell new employees, "If you don't know something, ask Daniel. He probably already fixed it." I took that as a compliment. Looking back, maybe it wasn't, because fixing everything quietly meant nobody ever realized how much depended on me. The company had a strange culture. The people who talked the most received the recognition. The people who spent more time networking than working were always invited to lunch with executives. Every quarterly meeting featured the same familiar faces accepting awards, while the people who kept operations running sat in the back of the room pretending to care. I never complained. I figured results would speak louder than personalities. That assumption cost me years. About 5 years into my job, our department director announced he was retiring. Everyone knew there would be an internal promotion. The operations supervisor position was exactly what I'd been working toward since my first year. I already handled most of the responsibilities anyway. I trained new employees. I covered management whenever supervisors were on vacation. I coordinated between purchasing, warehouse staff, transportation teams, and customer service. Several coworkers even joked that I had already been doing the supervisor's job without the title. For the first time in years, I actually allowed myself to feel optimistic. Brian encouraged me to apply. "You've earned this," he said. "I hope management sees it that way. They'd be crazy not to." I believed him. The interview went surprisingly well. 3 executives sat across from me asking about workflow optimization, vendor negotiations, employee management, and long-term planning. They nodded while I explained how we could reduce shipping delays simply by changing reporting procedures between departments. One of them even smiled. "That's an interesting idea." When I walked out, I genuinely thought I had done enough. For the next 2 weeks, everyone kept asking if I'd heard anything. Nothing. Then HR finally scheduled a department meeting. The announcement lasted less than 3 minutes. "We're pleased to welcome our new operations supervisor." It wasn't me. It was Kevin. Kevin had joined the company 11 months earlier. Before that, he'd worked in sales. He had almost no logistics experience. Half the warehouse employees didn't even know his last name. For a few seconds, I honestly thought there had been some mistake. Then everyone started clapping. Kevin stood up, smiled confidently, shook hands with the executives, and thanked everyone for believing in him. I forced myself to clap too. Inside, I felt completely numb. After the meeting, people kept stopping by my desk. "I thought it was going to be you. This doesn't make any sense. You deserve better." None of those conversations changed anything. Late that afternoon, Brian walked into my office and quietly closed the door. "I'm sorry." I looked at him. "You knew." He sighed before answering. "I found out yesterday. And I couldn't do anything." I wanted to ask more questions. Instead, I asked the only one that mattered. "Why him?" Brian rubbed his forehead. "Executive leadership wants someone who fits the company's future image." I stared at him. "What does that even mean?" He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said something I'll never forget. "Sometimes promotions aren't about who already does the job. They're about who people want representing the company." That sentence stayed with me for weeks, because I finally understood. It wasn't my work that had been evaluated. It was my visibility. Kevin spent hours talking to directors, volunteering for corporate events, organizing office celebrations, and making sure everyone important knew his name. While he was doing that, I was solving actual problems. The following Monday proved exactly what kind of decision management had made. Kevin called everyone into the conference room. He stood beside a projector displaying a colorful presentation filled with buzzwords. Efficiency, transformation, modern workflow, team alignment. It all sounded impressive, until he started explaining his new procedures. Within 10 minutes I noticed 3 major operational mistakes. By the end of the meeting I had counted 7. None of them were theoretical. Every single one would slow shipping, confuse warehouse scheduling, or increase overtime costs. I raised my hand carefully. I think there might be an issue with the receiving schedule. Kevin smiled politely. I appreciate the feedback. But we've already reviewed this with leadership. I understand. I'm just saying the warehouse only has capacity for. He interrupted me. Let's give the new system a chance. The room fell silent. Nobody said another word. After the meeting, one of the warehouse supervisors caught up with me near the loading docks. You were right. I know. So what do we do? I watched forklifts moving pallets across the warehouse floor. For now, we follow instructions. Even if they fail. Because sometimes people don't learn from warnings. Sometimes they only learn from consequences. And for the first time since joining the company, I stopped trying to save everyone from mistakes they refused to see. The first week under Kevin's leadership wasn't a disaster. At least not on the surface. Executives walked through the office smiling, congratulating themselves on choosing someone with fresh ideas. Kevin spent most of his days in meetings talking about culture, collaboration, and long-term growth. From the outside, everything looked polished. Inside the operations department, however, the problems started piling up almost immediately. The new receiving schedule looked great in a PowerPoint presentation. In reality, trucks began arriving faster than the warehouse could unload them. Drivers waited for hours. Storage areas became overcrowded. Forklift operators were constantly redirected because nobody knew which shipment had priority anymore. Customer complaints increased. Late deliveries became more common. Warehouse employees started working overtime almost every day. None of this surprised me. I'd warned them. Not because I was smarter than everyone else, but because I'd spent years dealing with these exact situations. Experience isn't exciting. It's just difficult to replace. Every morning Kevin held short team meetings. He spoke confidently. We're in a transition period. Some resistance is normal. We have to trust the process. Everyone nodded. Nobody mentioned that the process itself was creating most of the problems. Whenever someone raised a concern, Kevin had an answer ready. We need more data. We shouldn't jump to conclusions. Let's stay positive. Positive. That word became his favorite shield against reality. One afternoon I was reviewing freight reports when Sarah from customer service walked over to my desk. You've got a minute? Sure. She lowered her voice. Do you know why we're suddenly missing delivery windows? I have a few ideas. Our biggest client is furious. I know. They're threatening penalties. I wasn't surprised. That client represented nearly 15% of our monthly revenue. Losing them would be catastrophic. Sarah looked around before speaking again. Management keeps saying everything is under control. I smiled without humor. That's because they're reading reports. We're living them. She laughed quietly. Then her expression turned serious. So, are you going to tell them? I already did. And they weren't interested. She shook her head. I don't understand this place. Neither did I anymore. A month passed. The numbers continued getting worse. Shipping costs climbed. Employee turnover increased. Several experienced warehouse workers quit after being forced into endless overtime. Replacing them only made things harder because new employees needed weeks of training. Meanwhile, Kevin continued presenting colorful performance charts during management meetings. One Friday afternoon, Brian stopped by my desk again. You free for a walk? We stepped outside behind the warehouse where delivery trailers were lined up across the parking lot. He looked exhausted. You were right. I know. They won't admit it. I know. He sighed deeply. Corporate thinks the problems are temporary. And what do you think? I think we're creating problems faster than we solve them. For a moment neither of us spoke. Finally Brian looked at me. Can I ask you something honestly? Of course. Why are you still here? The question caught me off guard. I've asked myself that. You could leave. I could. You'd probably make more money somewhere else. Probably. So why stay? I watched another truck slowly back into a loading dock. Because this company had been my career. Because I'd invested 6 years here. Because I still believed things could improve. But none of those reasons sounded convincing anymore. I guess I kept hoping someone would eventually notice. Brian nodded. They already noticed. They just valued something else. That hurt because it was true. The following week everything changed. Not because management suddenly became smarter. Because our largest client finally had enough. An emergency meeting was called early Tuesday morning. The atmosphere was completely different. No motivational speeches. No colorful presentations. No smiling executives. Just tension. The vice president walked into the conference room carrying a folder thick enough to make everyone's stomach drop. He placed it on the table. These, he said calmly, are complaints from one customer. Silence. He opened the folder. Late shipments. Incorrect inventory counts. Missed deadlines. Communication failures. Penalty invoices. Every page represented another expensive mistake. Kevin cleared his throat. We've experienced some implementation challenges. The vice president interrupted him. I'm not interested in excuses. The room became painfully quiet. He continued. I want solutions. For the first time since becoming supervisor, Kevin didn't seem confident. He looked nervous. He glanced around the room as though someone else might answer for him. Nobody did. Then something unexpected happened. The vice president turned toward me. Daniel. I looked up. You've been here the longest. Yes. What would you change? Every eye in the room shifted toward me, including Kevin's. For a second I considered saying exactly what I thought. That every major issue could have been avoided. That experienced employees had been ignored. That leadership had confused confidence with competence. Instead I chose my words carefully. The warehouse needs a realistic receiving schedule. We need better communication between transportation and inventory. And supervisors need authority to adjust priorities when unexpected delays happen. Simple. Practical. Nothing revolutionary. Just things that had worked for years. The vice president nodded while taking notes. Kevin didn't say a word. After the meeting several coworkers stopped me in the hallway. You handled that well. You could have embarrassed him. You took the high road. Maybe. Or maybe I simply understood something Kevin still didn't. Being right isn't the same as making someone else look wrong. Unfortunately for him, reality would do that without my help. By the end of that month, another client announced they were reviewing their contract. Finance reported rising operational costs. Employee satisfaction reached its lowest level in years. And suddenly the executives who had ignored experienced voices started asking a different question. Not how to move forward, but how everything had gone wrong so quickly. They still didn't know the answer. But for the first time, they were finally looking in the right direction. The atmosphere inside the company changed almost overnight. For months, executives had dismissed every warning as negativity. Now they were the ones asking uncomfortable questions. Meetings that used to end with applause were suddenly filled with spreadsheets, performance reports, and long silences. No one was celebrating anymore. Kevin looked different too. His confident smile had disappeared. He still walked through the office with the same polished appearance, but people noticed the change. Instead of chatting in the hallways, he spent most of his time behind closed doors with senior management. Rumors spread quickly. Some people believed he was preparing a recovery plan. Others thought he was trying to protect himself. I didn't pay much attention to the gossip. I had enough work to keep me busy. Ironically, the operational problems everyone had ignored were now landing on my desk. Warehouse supervisors called me directly because they knew I'd answer. Drivers asked for advice when schedules didn't make sense. Customer service checked difficult orders with me before promising delivery dates. None of this was official. Just happened naturally. People trusted whoever could solve the problem. One Thursday afternoon, Brian stopped by my office carrying 2 folders. You've got a minute? Sure. He closed the door behind him. I need a favor. What kind of favor? He placed the folders on my desk. The executive team wants a complete review of our operations. I looked at him. So? They want you to prepare it. I almost laughed. They have a supervisor. They do. So why am I doing his work? Brian hesitated. Because they know you'll tell them what's actually happening. I leaned back in my chair. And Kevin knows about this? He does. What did he say? Brian gave me a tired smile. He wasn't thrilled. That wasn't surprising. For weeks he had insisted everything was improving. Real data would tell a different story. I spent the next several days reviewing every report from the previous quarter. Delivery times, inventory accuracy, labor costs, overtime hours, vendor complaints, customer penalties. I wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. I simply compared the numbers from before and after the new procedures had been introduced. The results were impossible to ignore. Shipping delays had increased by nearly 30%. Warehouse overtime had almost doubled. Inventory corrections were happening more frequently than at any point in the previous 3 years. Employee turnover had reached a record high. The company wasn't struggling because people weren't working hard enough. They were working harder than ever. They were just working inside a system that no longer made sense. When I finished the report, it was nearly 60 pages long. No dramatic language. No personal attacks. Just facts. Every conclusion included supporting data. Every recommendation focused on fixing the process instead of blaming individuals. On Monday morning, I presented it to the executive team. Kevin sat across the table without saying much. The vice president flipped through the report slowly. Finally, he looked up. Did you prepare all of this yourself? Yes. How long did it take? About 4 days. Another executive looked surprised. You already had all this information? I've been tracking it for months. The room became quiet. Not because the numbers were shocking. Because everyone realized the information had always been available. Nobody had bothered to ask. After the presentation, I expected to return to my desk. Instead, the vice president asked me to stay. Once everyone else left, he closed the conference room door. I owe you an apology. I didn't respond immediately. He continued. We should have listened sooner. I appreciated the honesty. It was the first genuine admission I'd heard from leadership in a long time. We all make decisions with the information we have, I replied. He shook his head. No. We had the information. We just listened to the wrong people. That sentence carried more weight than he probably realized. Before I left, he asked one more question. If we decide to reorganize the department, would you be willing to help? I looked through the conference room window toward the warehouse floor. For years I had wanted recognition. Now it was finally being offered. Strangely, it didn't feel as satisfying as I had imagined. Recognition after failure wasn't the same as trust from the beginning. I'll help, I said. But only if we're fixing the system. Not looking for someone to blame. He nodded. Fair enough. News spread faster than I expected. By Wednesday, everyone knew executives were reviewing the entire operations department. Kevin became unusually quiet. Then something happened that caught me completely off guard. Late that afternoon, he knocked on my office door. Can we talk? Sure. He stepped inside and closed the door. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he sighed. I owe you an apology. I wasn't expecting that. I should have listened when you raised concerns. I studied his face. For the first time since we'd met, he didn't sound defensive. He sounded exhausted. I thought I had to prove I could change everything. I didn't want to look like I was relying on someone who'd been here longer. So instead, I ignored experience. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he surprised me again. You weren't trying to make me fail. No. You were trying to help. Yes. He nodded slowly. I understand that now. It didn't erase everything that had happened, but it was honest. And sometimes honesty matters more than excuses. A week later, the company announced a restructuring of the operations department. Kevin was reassigned to a business development role that better matched his background. Brian accepted an early retirement package, and I was asked to serve as interim operations manager while the company decided how to move forward. When HR announced the change, several coworkers congratulated me. "You finally got what you deserved. It took long enough. I knew this would happen." I smiled politely, but inside I knew the truth. This wasn't a victory. It was an opportunity. The real challenge wasn't earning the title. It was proving that leadership wasn't about having the loudest voice in the room. It was about making everyone else's job easier. And that was exactly where the real work was about to begin. My first day as interim operations manager felt strangely ordinary. There was no celebration, no speech, no applause. HR handed me a new access badge, IT updated my permissions, and by 8 o'clock I was already dealing with a shipment that had been delayed because of bad weather. That was exactly how I wanted it. The title had changed. The work hadn't. The biggest difference wasn't the responsibility. It was the conversations. People who had barely acknowledged me for years were suddenly knocking on my office door asking for advice. Department managers wanted meetings. Executives wanted updates. Even employees from other divisions introduced themselves. I quickly realized something uncomfortable. Many of them weren't interested in my ideas. They were interested in my position. Power changes the way people treat you. Not because you've become a different person. Because they've decided you matter now. I promised myself I wouldn't make that mistake with anyone else. During my first week, I canceled nearly half the recurring meetings on the department calendar. Most of them produced nothing except long discussions and longer email chains. Instead, I spent my mornings in the warehouse. Not because I needed to supervise people. Because I needed to understand what was slowing them down. I walked every shipping lane. I spoke with forklift operators. I asked receiving clerks what frustrated them the most. I sat beside dispatch coordinators while they planned truck schedules. Every conversation revealed something useful. Most problems weren't caused by lazy employees. They were caused by unnecessary processes. One warehouse employee named Carlos summed it up perfectly. "We spend more time updating spreadsheets than moving freight." He wasn't exaggerating. The same shipment was being entered into 3 different systems by 3 different people. No wonder mistakes happened. Within 2 weeks, we eliminated duplicate reporting, simplified approval procedures, and gave supervisors the authority to solve small problems without waiting for management. The changes weren't revolutionary. They were practical. Almost immediately, overtime began to fall. Delivery accuracy improved. Employees stopped staying late just to finish paperwork. For the first time in months, the warehouse actually felt calm. The biggest surprise came from Kevin. After moving to business development, he stopped by my office one afternoon. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "I spent so much time trying to look like a leader that I forgot leadership isn't a performance." I nodded. "It's a lesson most people learn the hard way." He smiled. "I certainly did." Over the next few months, we actually developed a professional relationship. Not a friendship, but mutual respect. He turned out to be excellent at building relationships with new clients. I focused on making sure we could actually deliver what those clients were promised. For the first time, both of us were working in positions that matched our strengths. Sometimes the problem isn't that people are incompetent. They're simply in the wrong role. 3 months later, the company released its quarterly performance report. Late deliveries were down. Customer complaints had fallen significantly. Employee turnover dropped to its lowest level in years. Most importantly, our largest client renewed its contract for another 3 years. The vice president stopped by my office that afternoon. "I thought you'd like to know." He placed the signed contract on my desk. This wouldn't have happened 6 months ago. I looked at the document for a moment before closing the folder. It wasn't just me. I know. But someone had to start fixing it. A few weeks later, HR announced that the interim title would be removed. I officially became operations manager. This time there wasn't a big department meeting. No dramatic announcement. Just an email confirming the promotion. Oddly enough, I preferred it that way. The title mattered less now than it had before. What mattered was that people trusted the department again. Nearly a year after everything began, I was walking through the warehouse when I noticed a young coordinator helping a new employee understand the scheduling system. The new hire looked nervous. He apologized for asking so many questions. The coordinator laughed. Don't worry. We all started somewhere. If something doesn't make sense, ask. We'd rather explain it once than fix the same mistake 5 times. I smiled as I walked past. That sentence perfectly described the culture we had been trying to build. Later that evening, as I packed my bag to go home, I found the notebook I'd used before the promotion process had even started. Inside were pages filled with ideas I'd written years earlier. Some had already been implemented. Others no longer seemed necessary. On the very last page, I found a sentence I'd written after losing the promotion to Kevin. If I ever get the chance to lead, I'll make sure no one feels invisible. I stared at those words for a long moment. Back then, they had been written out of frustration. Now they felt like a promise. Looking back, losing that promotion was one of the most frustrating experiences of my career. At the time, it felt unfair. Maybe it was. But if I'd been promoted back then, I probably would have inherited the same broken culture instead of changing it. The experience taught me something no management seminar ever could. Recognition is temporary. Respect has to be earned every single day. Real leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It isn't about having the loudest voice, the most impressive presentation, or the biggest office. It's about listening before speaking, fixing problems instead of assigning blame, giving credit instead of collecting it, and making sure the people doing the hardest work know that someone actually sees them. Because every successful company depends on people who quietly solve problems no one else notices. I know. 4 years. I was one of them.